All right, so continuing from last time, I want to finish up talking about the fasted cardio issue and addressing the oft quoted, oft repeated, oft reshared Instagram triteness that fasted cardio has no benefits. Last time I just looked at some biology for the most part, physiology of fat loss, in terms of how initial body fat percentage could impact on different potential bottlenecks. I then began looking at a paper by Escalante and his colleagues that addressed the issue very similar but different way than I did. Finished that one mainly by looking at the acute studies, which I don't find very relevant, and the chronic studies, of which there are very few. One was a Ramadan study, not well controlled, can't draw a lot of conclusions. One was a review paper, and Escalante finished by mentioning that only two papers had directly looked at body fat percentage as an endpoint, and specifically looked at one of them. And I finished by asking if anybody could guess what the paper was, or more importantly, guess who it was by. In 2014, Brad Schoenfeld and colleagues published a paper titled Body Composition Changes Associated with Fasted versus Non-Fasted Aerobic Exercise. It's in the Journal of International Society of Sports Nutrition, volume 11, page 54. So far as I can tell, this is more or less where the entirety of the belief that fasted cardio has no benefit came from, the results of this one study. Because if you read it, even the authors of the study didn't mention the Ramadan study in their discussion. They writing, to the author's knowledge, this is the first study to investigate body composition changes associated with aerobic exercise, performed in the fasted versus fed state, while subject maintained a calorie deficit. The Ramadan study was in 2012. They didn't know about it, and I'm not criticizing them. I don't think anybody knew about it. I didn't. Does tell me they didn't look very hard. Note. The original draft of this article, which is about 5 times as long, I went off on one of my long, irrelevant rants about what I call the just one paper issue, right? When one paper comes out that this evidence-based crew doesn't like, suddenly that paper, it's just one paper and must be replicated. But when just one paper by one of their own comes out, it is the final fucking word on the topic. And the conclusions will be stated in absolute terms, and this is a good example of that. It's just one paper. And yet, done by the leader of this evidence-based circle jerk, the ones that don't have the guts to step up to me regarding training to show me what 0 reps in reserve is. But because it came from them, now it's become truth by repetition, by everybody sharing the wrong fucking Instagram meme. It's cute, isn't it? So let's look at what Brad's study did. The study took 20 women who reported performing aerobic activity several times per week. The paper states that several were off-season track and field athletes, but no indication is given of how many that was. I usually take the word several to mean more than one, but less than a few. So maybe 3, 4. I don't have any idea. It seems rather trivial to just say 3 were off-season track and field athletes. And Brad can't even use the word count excuse for this. For the duration of the study, the women performed 50 minutes on a treadmill, 70% of maximum heart rate, 3 days per week, and they were supervised. Half did the cardio fasted, the other half did it after eating. The subjects were instructed to not perform extra activity. Now, we might raise the question of whether or not highly active women did or did not adhere to this. And it's interesting that Brad once brought this up to dismiss a paper he didn't like, asking, well, we don't know if they did extra arm work or not. But again, what's good for the goose is clearly not good enough for the gander. The women were given a specific hypocaloric diet designed by Alan Aragon to put them in a 500 calorie deficit. Protein was sufficient at 1.8 grams per kilogram. Dietary fat was 25 to 30%. And I wouldn't expect this to be stupid coming from him. The woman also received a standardized protein carb shake. The fed group drank it before their cardio. The fasted group drank it right after. And this is better controlled than most papers used in this case, so I'll give him points for that. Dietary adherence was tracked through MyFitnessPal, and look, this is the best you can do, right? Controlling food intake, Truly controlling it for even short periods of time is insanely expensive and isn't realistic. But we also know that food records are rough at best. But this is the reality of the situation, and I'm not going to dismiss this out of hand methodologically, because doing so, you'd have to dismiss like 99% of research. You just have to accept it as a limitation and move on. It's the best we can do. Measurements were made via tape measure for circumferences to calculate BMI. Body fat was measured by BODPOD, which they state shows a good consistency with DEXA in this population. Okay. The women did self-report identical nutrient intakes over the length of the study, and this didn't differ between groups. Within the limitation of food records, we can take this at face value because there's no other option. Here are the body composition results in chart form. And the thing to first note is that the average body fat percentage for the women was 26.3% for the fasted group, 24.8% in the non-fasted, which are both right above low end of my category 2. Obviously, there was variance in this, right? And based on the standard deviations given, and assuming a normal distribution, we can conclude that it's likely that more than half of the women had a body fat between 18.4% and 34.2%. And I know that's a weird way of phrasing it, but without the actual ranges, all you can do is base it on the standard deviation. But that's a pretty wide range. 18 to 34, it's from the middle of my category 1 to the high end of my category 2. But this also means that only a handful, several, were towards the leaner end. And I would speculate it's track and field athletes. I can't say that for sure, it's my speculation. But what that also means is that only several, a handful, some small number of the entire group was even in the body fat percentage range that I would argue has the potential for fasted cardio to benefit, as I discussed in part 1. In any case, as you can see from the chart, both groups showed a significant drop in body weight from start to finish, although the drop was identical. Neither group showed a significant difference in changes in body fat percentage. The study states there was a trend for an effective time, p equals 0.06, with a trend for decrease in body fat from pre to post. The good old trend, which doesn't mean anything. Didn't reach statistical significance, whether you like it or not. If you set a p less than 0.05 cutoff, you got to use it, and the study didn't reach it. So in this sense, we can say that the change in body fat percentage wasn't different for fasted versus fed cardio, but it wasn't significant from either group. So, Basically, the fasted group's non-significant change in body fat percentage was equivalent to the fed group's non-significant change in body fat percentage, which doesn't say much. But that said, there was a statistically significant change in actual fat mass in kilograms or pounds that was significant, but there was no difference between the two groups, which is the important bit here. Now, if you're wondering how there can be no statistically significant change in body fat percentage, but changes in body fat in fat mass, well, statistics. It's just the way the math works sometimes, right? I would mention that the average change in fat mass was 0.7 kilos, 1.5 pounds in the fed group, and 0.9 kilos, about 2 pounds in the fasted group, just under a 0.5 pound difference. Keep in mind, these were 3 50-minute aerobic sessions. Would this differential have been larger with more sessions? Can't say. Now, in the discussion, the paper does look at the same science I described above, limitations including the issue of food self-reporting. They mentioned that both groups lost less fat than predicted, so they probably did underreport their true calorie intake. It's impossible to say if one group underreported more than another. They also do acknowledge, in Brad's credit, that the women might have done extra cardio outside of the study. They write, in conclusion, our findings indicate that body composition changes associated with aerobic exercise in conjunction with a hypocaloric diet are similar regardless of whether or not an individual is fasted prior to training. Hence, those seeking to lose body fat conceivably can choose to train either before or after eating based on preference. It should be noted that given the small sample size and short study duration, we cannot rule out the possibility that either condition might confer a small benefit over the other with respect to fat loss. Further study is warranted in a longer-term trial with a greater number of participants. Now, that's good, they say to the conclusions, and funnily much more guarded language than the volume study, but that's neither here nor there. So the study's not bad, right? Even by Brad's low standards for scientific rigor. And you don't have to blind the BODPOD, which is why I didn't bring it up. Food was not controlled, but it never is in this population or most studies. BOD-POD isn't the best method for measuring body fat percentage, but it's cheaper than DEXA. One thing to consider, the Aaron measurement for the BOD-POD is listed as 1 to 2.7%, which is larger than the average change in body fat percentage during the study, which were only 0.7% in the fed group, 1.3% in the fasted group. Within the context of average fat loss, there's only about 2 pounds for both groups. When the measurement error exceeds the apparent change, it's really hard to conclude much of anything because the variability in measurement is greater than the actual change that was supposedly measured. But there you go. Got one study, pretty well done. No significant difference in fat loss between a group of women who did fasted versus non-fasted cardio. Mind you, their conclusion is interesting since it clearly acknowledges the limitations of the study and the possibility that a small benefit might occur. Now, it doesn't say which way. It's possible that fed might be better than fasted. I'm not saying if it's fasted is superior. Somehow, this one paper with very guarded conclusions reached the online fitness space and led them to conclude that fasted cardio not only does not have any benefit, but can't possibly have any benefit. Never seen the statement, or I don't recall seeing it qualified in all the trite memes that get shared. It's almost like nobody read past the abstract or even attempted to read the actual paper. They just are reposting a meme that they saw. Moving on. All right, so that was the study. Let's go back to the Escalante paper. What did they have to say about this just one study? First, they do acknowledge that it's the first one to use an actual hypocaloric diet that was tracked using an online diary that was actually geared towards weight or fat loss, as they write. Hence, out of the 5 studies included in the Hackett Review article, only one study's design would be similar and parallel to how physique competitors approach their diet when attempting to lose body fat. However, that's where the similarities start and stop, and they mention the differences. They point out that while the women in Schoenfeld et al. Were given 1.8 grams per kilo of protein, physique competitors are often recommended to and or consume more than that. While the women in Schoenfeld performed 3 supervised aerobic sessions per week, physique competitors perform aerobic activity at various frequencies, intensities, and durations. As well, they point out while the average body fat percentage in Schoenfeld et al. Was 24 to 26%, the typical physique competitor may start at 10.5 to 14% for men and 20.3 to 22.7 for women, both well within my category 1. And as I mentioned, that's the place where I would expect fasted cardio to potentially have a benefit. So already we see some differences between the just one study and what might apply to a lean diet or physique athlete. They eat more protein, may do more longer different intensity aerobic activity, in addition to weight training and possibly interval training, and usually start out leaner, my category 1. This is why I define it this way. To that, we might consider the difference in the study group in Schoenfeld et al. That was certainly dieting and tracking, although possibly underreporting, to hardcore dieters who may be controlling their food intake to the gram, which lean dieters generally are. We're trying to get very lean. I could probably get way up my own ass about the potential impact of exercise on appetite and hunger, but I won't. The point being that even small systematic differences in true calorie intake between the fasted and fed group would easily eliminate any small potential changes in body fat percentage, just like in the Ramadan study. Now, I'm not saying that they did or they didn't. I'm simply saying that it's another difference to consider in terms of drawing conclusions about fasted versus fed cardio from this study to the lean hardcore dieter. And now we get to the important bit. Because one thing you might have noticed I left out about Brad's study was the duration. It was only 4 weeks. Now, even the shortest contest diets in the modern era are at least triple that. Only drug users can get away with a 10-week or 8-week prep, right? In the modern era, a 6-month to 24-week long diet is fairly common. Even for the relatively lean male or female looking to get significantly leaner, say 15 to 18% body fat for men, 24 to 16% for women, you're looking easily at 8+ weeks under most circumstances and frequently longer. And this is super important, as Escalante states, because preparation for competition requires time. The longer the prep, the more important small changes can compound to yield greater final results. Let me make it clear that Brad's paper specifically did mention this. First, the duration of the testing period was fairly short, lasting just 4 weeks. While this period is certainly significant to attain significant fat loss, it remains possible that subtle changes between protocols would take more time to manifest. Right? So Brad did address this in a well-phrased and guarded conclusion. My issue is that this has been completely missed in the trite bullshit Instagram memes. I do wonder if when Brad presented the results of his study online, he presented it in quite such a nuanced way. For example, our new paper's results will blow volume recommendations out of the water. Not saying he did or he didn't. Things I wonder about. The point they're making is that small changes over short periods of time can become big changes over longer periods of time. So let's do some hypothetical math. Let's assume that under a specific set of conditions, fasted cardio nets an extra 0.25 pounds of fat loss per week. I'm not saying it does or it doesn't. Let's just assume. Across 4 weeks, that's 1 pound difference in fat loss. This is unlikely to be statistically significant. We might even question its real-world significance in the big picture for most people, but bear with me. In the Schoenfeld et al. Study, the average difference in fat loss was only 0.5 pounds, a value far too small to reach statistical significance. Again, that 0.5 pounds per week was that 0.5 pounds is based on an assumed 3 sessions per week. Many, if not most, physique athletes do more than this, and you might expect greater difference. What if they'd done 6 sessions? Would it have gone to a full pound over a month? Don't know, just saying. But like I said, assume that someone is doing 6 sessions of fasted cardio per week, and this is netting them an extra 1/4 pound of fat loss per week. Again, not saying it does or doesn't, assume. Across 8 to 24 weeks, this potentially has a 2 to 6 pound fat loss difference. Now, for a physique competitor, a 6 pound greater fat loss is enormous, right? It's the difference between placing or winning and losing, or even getting into stage condition. Even for the lean dieter looking to get very lean, it can matter. 2 pound extra fat loss over 8 weeks is 2 weeks less dieting to reach a specific goal. It's even more true if losing that fat means less muscle loss. Let me state again, I am not saying that fasted cardio does or does not cause this to happen. I'm simply expanding on what the Escalante paper talked about. Because following this train of thought, they offered their analysis. The fasted group went from 26.3 plus or minus 7.9% to 25 plus or minus 7.7%. From 16.5 plus or minus 5.5 kilos to 15.4 plus or minus 5.5 kilos of fat mass. Whereas the fed group went from, okay, look, I'm just going to put this chart. Adding, although the difference between the two groups did not reach statistical significance, failing to reach statistical significance does not always mean it is not practically relevant. Now, these are their words, not mine. They are correct. In the real world of sport, where less than 1% can separate first and last, microscopic differences in improvements or performance can matter. But in the average 8-week exercise physiology study with limited numbers, such a small difference is probably not going to reach statistical significance. This works in reverse too. Result can be statistically significant, but utterly real-world meaningless. I've read diet papers in overweight individuals that use some intervention and found a statistically significant increase in weight loss over 12 weeks. And the actual difference was like 1 pound or 0.08 pounds per week. Statistically significant? Sure. Real world significant for someone carrying a lot of excess weight? No. At the same time, there's a slight issue with this train of thought, which gets into the weeds about what statistical significance is and what it represents. Because based on the data as presented, it is correct to conclude that the fasted group lost slightly more fat on average. But without getting into all the p-ratio cutoff controversy, the fact is that the results did not reach statistical significance. So the results are also compatible with the null hypothesis, that there is no difference between the groups, or rather that fasted and fed cardio generated no difference in fat loss. Right? Since p-value didn't reach statistical significance, you can't exclude the null and even conclude that the difference in fat loss was due to the intervention. So maybe the fasted group did lose a little more fat. Maybe it's because they ate a little bit less. Without reaching p less than 0.05, you can't say it was the fasted cardio. In that sense, the effect sizes, which I won't get into, it's essentially a measure of the magnitude of the change, are worth considering. They were 0.2 for the fasted group, 0.11 for the fed group. Certainly the fasted group's effect size was double, but both values are considered small. Mind you, James Krieger would say, is a doubling of the result worth not considering? And yeah, doubling is not worth considering when it's from small to a little bit less small. Again, what is small over 4 weeks may become large over a longer time interval, but we don't have that data yet. So I'm talking about statistics. A quick little side rant, something I'm known for, just something I find interesting. Whenever Brad or James or pretty much any of them do a statistical analysis and the effect sizes are small, as they are in this paper, they conclude that there is no effect of the intervention, or there's no significant effect. That's what small or trivial effect sizes mean. And they're not wrong, right? That is correct. A trivial or small effect size does not mean much, and I'm not saying that it does. However, this seems to be applied selectively. Going back to the volume paper from a year and a half ago, has it been that long? The statistics in that paper were equally weak, right? For all 4 muscle groups, p-value of less than 0.05 was not reached. Not for any of them. Now, by throwing a different statistical analysis, one never used before or since, they found that 2 muscles were still not significant. The BF10 was less than 1. And the other 2 muscles reached a BF10 less than 3, which by the text that was cited by the paper is considered meaningless. Yet somehow they reached the conclusion, online anyway, that our new paper will blow old volume recommendations out of the water, despite the statistics being completely weak that the highest volume group was superior to the middle volume. It's almost like they change the rules depending on whether they agree or disagree with the research. Wait, I mean, that's exactly what they do. Finally, James Krieger, I'm still waiting to see the statistical reference you asserted to Brian Butcher exists, that showing a BF less than 10 is not meaningless. It's been 1.5 years since I asked you to provide that, and yet you haven't. And that's because we both don't know it doesn't exist. So it's time to admit that you were fucking lying. So let's return to the starting body fat percentage issue. As above, the average body fat of both groups was in the low end of my category 2 with variability. Some were leaner, some were fatter. And I suspect the track athletes were in the leaner group, but that's a guess. This brings up another issue endemic to studies like this. When you collapse all the subject data together, you often end up missing the details, in the sense that you don't get the individual results. Many studies these days are providing individual results, and they're demonstrating how the averages can be very misleading. Because what you start to see is that in some subjects get a bigger response than others, and others get very little response. In hypertrophy studies, you often see a situation where one guy gets this huge response, and that pulls up the average of the group, which makes it, on average, some people lose size, right? The variance is often bigger in any given intervention than between the groups. Addressing this, Escalante et al. Right, in addition, because the individual results of the participants were not reported in this study, it is not possible to determine the individual variability of fat mass and fat-free mass over the course of the intervention. Maybe the few women that started out leaner did in fact lose significantly more fat. Maybe they didn't. I don't know, and you don't know either. When all you see is an average with its own variability, you can't know one way or the other. When you consider that statistically only a handful of the women were likely to be in my category 1, it would be really hard to show a benefit of one type of cardio over the other when you average them. Let's assume that only lean dieters will see any benefit from fasted cardio, the explanation in the first half of this article. Again, I'm assuming. If only a few of the total subject numbers were lean, any benefit they might have gotten will be overshadowed by the averaging. Now, one way to address this would be to provide individual data to see if the leaner women saw a difference for fasted versus fed cardio. Another would be able to do a sub-analysis of the very lean women so you divide them up, right? You go, okay, this is the women at 25% and above and 25% below or whatever. The problem is that with only 20 subjects and the realistically small number of lean subjects, it's would have been both meaningless and probably impossible. So I'm not saying they should have done it. I'm saying this would be one way to approach it if you have more people. Another way would be if all the women had been at a sufficiently low body fat percentage, closer to physique levels, this would have given, I think, more stronger data. But that's not what happened. All we have is the data, which is the data, which is the data. In that vein, Escalante ad. Finally, the hormonal and metabolic changes a lean physique competitor will encounter to get to extremely low levels of body fat will be more drastic as they get closer to competition compared to an individual who starts a fat loss program at higher levels of body fat and is only looking to get to healthy levels of body fat. That's why I addressed the physiology and the categories, right? 10 years ago, I wrote that I would not expect women and men in the average or high body fat percentages to see any benefit in terms of fat loss from fasted cardio. There's no physiological reason to think that they would. I would not argue that point. It's when you're looking at my category 1, men at 12 to 15% trying to get lower, the women at 20 to 24% that fasted cardio might have a benefit. Might. And I'm sorry, but the Schoenfeld study cannot speak to that population exclusively. Even if some of the females were that lean, any advantage would have gotten overwhelmed by the non-results in women carrying more fat, and the calorie intake issue, and the protein intake issue, and all the stuff Escalante brought up. Escalante conclude, hence, any minor benefit that may be derived from fasted cardio should be considered and further investigated with physique competitors undergoing conditions that more closely represent how they may perform fasted and fed cardio before definitive conclusions can be drawn about the effectiveness of the two modes of cardio to improve body composition. Basically, we need more research, but we always do. To finish up looking at the Escalante paper, the final topic they looked at is something they called protein-enhanced cardio, basically consuming some protein prior to or during aerobic exercise. They didn't really define it, but that's what I'm going to take it to mean. Based on the literature they cite, they may be just considering higher protein mixed meals, but I'm not 100% sure. As they state, maximizing fat loss while minimizing lean body mass loss is a key aspect of physique preparation. Concern often raised about fasted cardio is the potential for muscle loss. Okay, now it's true that amino acids are used for energy during aerobic exercise, but the impact is fairly small. Under most conditions, about 5% of the total calorie expenditure comes from protein. This can be doubled if glycogen is depleted, and that is common during a diet. It's still a relatively small amount. If someone were to burn 450 calories during an aerobic session, which is a good bit, 5 to 10% is 22 to 45 calories, which is 5 to 10 grams of protein. At a typical brisk walking pace, an hour might burn 300 calories. 5 to 10% is at most 30 calories, 8 grams of protein. I mean, every little bit counts, don't get me wrong. Right, but 1 pound of muscle contains 120 grams of protein. So assuming all of that protein came from muscle would represent 1/24 to 1/12 of a pound of muscle. Now, of course, if you're doing that 6 days a week, it only takes 12 days to lose a pound or 24 days, right? But realistically, these amino acids are not coming from muscle. They're coming from the free amino acid pool to begin with. At least that's what I've heard. So I don't really see this or see muscle loss as a real concern. The small amount of burned amino acids, again from the free pool, can be readily replaced by even a small amount of protein consumed during or after training. Now, they mentioned some other potential benefits of protein-enhanced cardio, although I find most of the references pretty weak. First, they looked at the thermic effect of food and cite 2 papers which fed either 900 or 750 calories before cardio and found a microscopic increase in calorie expenditure. It was 12 to 36 calories over 3 hours, which doesn't really matter when you're eating 750 to 900 to get it. But the thermic effect of food studies are always irrelevant like this. A physique athlete wouldn't have the room to eat that much before cardio. So that's a non-starter. They claim that protein during aerobic activity may prevent muscle breakdown, but the paper cited, which is Position Stand, only mentions a single study where protein was added to carbohydrate during endurance activity. They next contend that protein prior to exercise increases energy expenditure. Their first paper cited is on protein and resistance training, which is no relevance here. The second compared 24 grams of carbs of protein before aerobic, interval, or resistance training in women. Found a roughly 60 calorie greater calorie expenditure in the protein group compared to the carbohydrate group. But there was no control group to compare to, and women had an average of 28% body fat. I question its relevance to lean physique dieters or physique athletes or dieters. They argue that higher protein in the morning can impact on food intake and appetite later. 3 of the 4 studies were looking at a high protein mixed breakfast. The 4th looked at an egg-based breakfast versus a bagel breakfast. None involved exercise, and there's nothing to say that protein immediately after morning fasted cardio wouldn't have an identical effect. So I don't think those are relevant. Only a single study they cite seems to have much relevance. In it, men were given 25 grams of whey, casein, maltodextrin, or nothing as a control prior to 30 minutes of relatively moderate aerobic activity. During the exercise, the casein group burned a whopping 1 gram of extra fat between minutes 10 to 15 and 25 to 30, 1 gram. Energy expenditure measured 15 minutes after the exercise bout was a little bit higher. Yes, every bit counts, but these effects tend to be very short-lived. Perhaps the most interest to me is that fat oxidation was not impaired in any group. In fact, both the casein and maltodextrin group burned a little more fat than the whey protein group during exercise. I find this bizarre because even the insulin response from the carbohydrate should have impaired fat oxidation. Mind you, the average body fat percentage of the men was 19% in my category 2. I question the relevance of this to lean dieters. I want to see data, and I could be wrong, but I question the relevance of this citation list. So overall, I don't find their argument for protein-enhanced cardio, at least as they're describing, to be that well supported. Not based on that literature, as only one of those papers is really relevant as far as I'm concerned. There is the separate issue that they didn't really consider, which is that eating before cardio will reduce free fatty acid levels due to increased insulin, semi-defeating the purpose. This will be especially true in the very lean, for the reasons I described above. Fat mobilization is the limiting factor at play, and raising insulin prior to cardio may negate the potential benefit. Now, it didn't in that one study, which is, I find, strange. But again, wasn't in very lean individuals, where insulin can have a much more potent effect. So whether it's a high-protein mixed meal or protein alone, I don't find the data terribly convincing for very lean dieters or physique athletes, which is what we're talking about here. Which isn't to say I don't see a possible benefit of consuming a small amount of protein during morning fasted cardio. Even 6 to 10 grams of protein would more than offset any potential burning of amino acids during the cardio. Once you've started exercise, insulin response is blunted. So you're not raising insulin before cardio, which might lower fatty acid levels, but you're still getting the protein during aerobic activity, which seems like the best of all worlds. So let me wrap up by looking at some of Escalante's conclusions. They state, obviously, fat loss may always require a long-term imbalance between energy intake and activity. That over time, as people get leaner, fat loss becomes more difficult. This leads them to mention that physique competitors are attempting to reach the extremes of low body fat and may encounter fat loss plateaus that may not occur in the general dieter. They state correctly that studies have not been done on physique competitors, or my category 1 dieters. The difference is initial body fat percentage, protein intake, resistance training, etc. may make studies done on other populations of less relevance. Further, small changes in fat loss here may not only add up over long times, but may be more critical at the extremes. They also bring up the unaddressed issue in this paper, which is the use of thermogenics or fat burners, which may also impact on fat oxidation. In that vein, I'd mention that yohimbine hydrochloride, a compound that inhibits the fat mobilization inhibiting alpha-2 receptors, only works if insulin is low. If you're going to use it, it can only be used under fasted conditions. They come on a bunch of other stuff that doesn't really matter, the chronic adaptations to fasted cardio and enzymes, and conclude that protein-enhanced cardio may offer some benefit. So that's their conclusion. What's mine? So after posting part 1 of this little 2-part series, someone made me aware of a gem of an image, a perfect example of the bullshit Instagram direction that the fitness industry has gotten. And here it is. Is it funny? I guess. Is it trite? Oh yeah. Is it edgy? I guess. But is it right? Okay, first off, 2006 to 2013? How old was the person that wrote this? Fasted cardio has been recommended since at least the 80s, possibly earlier. You kids today, you don't know nothing about nothing. And what about that line, debunked one too many times and finally gave up? Really? How so? Because the acute fat oxidation studies don't really answer it. Were they debunked by something else? Because factually there is one fucking paper, limited in duration and scope, directly addressing the issue. One fucking paper. And somehow that means debunked one too many times? It was barely debunked one time. Yet somehow, that one time is sufficient to throw out the idea completely and make a bullshit meme like this. For fuck's sake, people. For fuck's sake. Is the case closed? Is fasted cardio useless in terms of potentially enhancing fat loss? As I've said for years, said above, we'll repeat here, in a majority of cases I wouldn't disagree with that statement, that it has no real benefits over non-fasted cardio. For those carrying excess body fat, or even in a moderate body fat range, there's not only no seeming benefit, but no reason to expect one on a physiological level. In the case of someone carrying excess body fat, plenty of fatty acids available. The body neck is burning them due to loss of metabolic flexibility. Doing fasted cardio to take advantage of increased blood fatty acid levels wouldn't be expected to have an impact. Cardio can and should be done whenever the person will do it. For the individual in the moderate body fat range, there's no real reason to expect a benefit either. Pretty much everything works here. Fatty acid mobilization is fine, transport is fine, the person isn't down to stubborn fat yet, fat oxidation is fine. I wouldn't expect there to be a benefit. Cardio can and should be done whenever the person will do it. What about the very lean dieter? The male at 12 to 15% attempting to get lower, the female at 20 to 20% wanting to get very lean. This might be a physique athlete, a hardcore lean dieter, a performance athlete who has to get very lean. Because here the physiology changes. Fat mobilization, especially women's lower body fat, can become an issue. It's on top of all the other adaptations that are occurring. Admittedly, this is a small percentage of the dieting population, and I'm not saying that it's not. Because has it conclusively been shown that fasted cardio is useless? Clearly, I don't think so, or I wouldn't have spent so long on this. At this point, the data is too limited to draw that conclusion. The one study nobody seems to know about on athletes during Ramadan was too poorly controlled to draw any conclusion. This leaves us with the one paper. While more relevant to dieters, cannot be automatically extrapolated to all contexts. The women's average body fat was out of the range where I would expect to benefit. Even the inclusion of some lean women doesn't change that without having access to individual data. Couple that with a short duration of only 4 weeks, only 3 sessions of aerobic exercise, uncontrolled food intake relative to psycho dieters, we have a situation far removed from what we've seen in the extremely lean dieter, and especially the competitive physique or performance athlete who's psychotic about counting calories to the gram. Here, any small benefit from fasted cardio would be unlikely to show up over a duration that short. When a physique athlete or very lean dieters are doing 3 to 6 months of straight dieting, small changes can add up to big differences. Brad's paper made that point in the discussion, again to his credit. But this point has been completely lost on Instagram, when people are sharing these fucking memes. So does this mean that I'm saying that fasted cardio does or will have a benefit for the lean dieter? No, that is not what I'm saying, even though I know people will accuse me of that. What I'm saying is that based on one paper with severe limitations, I think it's a little too early to throw the baby out with the bathwater on this one. In at least one very specific context, the very lean dieter, the physique athlete, the high performance athlete, it seems possible that fasted cardio could still have benefits. It's also possible that it doesn't. And if a study is done in that population that says it doesn't, I'll be happy to accept that. But based on the data of one paper, I think that conclusion is preliminary, at least presented without context or nuance. 'Cause because putting it as number 3 in your list of 8 absolutist statements about the fitness world for your Instagram doesn't make it true by repetition.